So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, all the way from Roseburg. Denise Barrett is Executive Director of the Forest Bridges, the O&C Forest Habitat Project. That's a mouthful. So she's going to talk tonight about some of the backgrounds for O&C lands, something that I think maybe a lot of you didn't know about. I didn't know so much about the O&C lands and what that represents, and the unique, I think, an important role that Forest Bridges plays, including their mission, the vision, history, and impact that they've had over the last 10 years as a 501c nonprofit, kind of a moderator in these important decisions on forest and land management. Denise, give Denise a warm welcome, please.
Thank you, sir. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Well, first, Harry was the one that invited me after John Marshall had presented to you last spring. I wrote to Harry and I said, you know, we'd like to come in and give a talk. We know John. John actually has worked with us. You're going to see some of John's work tonight in the slides. And then Tim and I got together, and this was a very complicated pre-show technical discussion. And then we got here and we hit a bit of a snag, but I think everything's going to work and no problem. So I'm really, really delighted to be here tonight. And I bring some experience, a little bit in the forestry sector, but a lot of my experience has been, I've worked internationally, I've worked nationally, I've worked regionally. Before coming here, I helped to stand up and lead the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization, which is based in the Portland metropolitan region. And after COVID, the wildfires of 2020, and some other things going on, I needed a break after 10 years. And so I went to Northern California for a minute, and then I found this job and decided to take on this, what is really a complicated situation, as maybe many of you know, especially since you're a very esteemed chapter of a very esteemed conservation organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about Forest Bridges and our active conservation management. I'm going to give you some background. Let me see if I can get this to go. For some reason, it's not going. There we go. So brief background of the O&C lands and Forest Bridges mission, vision, and impact to date. That's what Tim was talking about. An overview of our work products. I'll throw in some basic ecology and management of the Pacific Northwest Forest. We'll look at the Northwest Forest Plan and its impact and other things that have been impacting in terms of the drivers of where we are today in terms of the conditions of the forests. So current and historical forest conditions and the primary drivers. And then I give you a few samplings of our principles and try to unpack our active conservation management proposals, which intend to look across all of the lands in terms of their application, specific to dry, moist, and what we call transitional forests, which are dry and moist forests. So before I state our mission statement, you can read it actually for yourself. The history really dates back to 2015 when a group of colleagues that became friends down in Roseburg, after so many decades of what they thought was unresolved issues in terms of federal forest management, even though there was the Northwest Forest Plan, even though there was, a whole bunch of environmental laws, et cetera, they weren't really feeling happy with what was going on in terms of constant tension, litigation, just really unresolved issues in terms of forest management, and especially changes in management that now we'll talk about here in a minute. So basically, they are a grassroots collaborative founded in 2015. I've worked for them 3.5 years, really been delighted to be at the helm with a board that's a strong representation of conservation, timber. We've had some tribal members, but we still have tribal partners and other people with different positions. And so we're really trying to come up with solutions to really foster sustainable forest health and multi-species habitats through active management, a form of active management on these 2.1 acres of O&C lands in Western Oregon. And I will go into that a little bit. I've got to get through a couple of slides first. So we partner with tribal nations. There are 9 tribes in Oregon that have their traditional homelands in the O&C lands. And we have a range of partnerships. I'd say our strongest is with the Cow Creek tribe. And then there are other tribes that we have different level of relationship and discussions. We partner with other nonprofits, scientists, governments, business, and the public. This is our structure. So we have a board of directors that really are the essence of making the final decisions when it comes to our principles of agreement. These are collaborative principles around the direction of the management of O&C lands. Staff with me today is our newest staff, Kimmy Waldrich, a recent OSU grad who's working with us on our communications and community engagement. And I'm, as I said, the executive director. We've had different levels of staffing, and I was talking to what's your name again? Michael, sorry, Michael. Michael, about, a lot of nonprofits have faced a lot of challenges this year, especially with funding. And so we've had to retrench a couple of positions just to keep alive. We have council of advisors. And so out in the external world, representatives, again, of the different positions, we have different people who can speak to and contribute to the way that we develop our principles and other products in our work. We also are really happy that we have like this whole group of independent scientists and ecocultural reviewers cutting across Western science, indigenous science and knowledge. I'm going to show you a slide in a second of those. And then the other thing that's really important to us is our base of support. We have Friends of Forest Bridges and followers through our social media. And that would be about 1,300 people at this point, which may not sound like a lot, but it was a hard work getting it to build up that way. When I first came, it was about 200. And so we've done a lot of work to try to get more people on board and aware. This is a list of some of our scientists. You may recognize some of those names like Jerry Franklin, maybe Christina Eisenberg, who just left Oregon State University, who's a tribal member of 2 different tribes, and an ecologist who's written a lot of books, including on wolf and sort of apex species. And John Bailey, who's still at the college, and he's focusing on silviculture, but he's been really, really instrumental in helping us with our understanding of how to manage for fire ecology, basically. John Garland is also an emeritus professor, John Marshall, who of course presented to you, and so on and so forth. There are also a whole group of scientists that prefer not to be named, not because that they're shy, but they work for organizations and they're really representing themselves, not their organization, and it's kind of, they want to make sure that they're in the background. So here's our vision in a very pointed way: improve forest health and fire resilience. So I'm going to be defining some of these terms in the next couple slides. Thriving wildlife habitats, strengthen rural communities and economies, and sustain inclusive collaboration, achieving this sort of long-term active management. There really aren't any collaboratives on the O&C lands per se. You'll often hear in the Forest Service there is a formal collaborative program of work on the ground. And so part of us is, we're working in the policy space right now and hopefully on the ground eventually. So fire resilience is really the ability of an ecosystem to withstand, adapt to, and recover from wildfires while retaining their essential functions, structure, composition, and identity. You sometimes hear fire resistance. So we have fire resistant trees that can sustain fire going through them. Fire resilience is actually where these impacts that might be pretty heavy on a forest, the trees can bounce back. And then active management, in case you don't know what it means, is the direct human intervention in a forest to achieve specific goals, improve its health, and harvest timber, et cetera, enhancing wildlife. Sometimes there is this notion that we shouldn't be in the forest managing, but we are very much in favor of it. And I'll give you some of the reasons why as we go through this. This is a graphic representation. If you go onto our website, forestbridges.org, this shows you a little bit, just a snapshot of our principles of agreements in the roots. At the top is, I get to use my wand here. At the top is this bridge. So we're bridging the different positions, and we're creating this collaborative around in the short term, to be able to really build up the body of work that we need to be able to take it across the bridge through collaboration and trust into a long-term engagement with the land management agencies, who are the BLM and the Forest Service. And all these ones down there, I don't want to go into them in too many details because I'm going to highlight some of these in my talk. Just gives you that chance. So those are directives, kind of looking at what we want to say to the land management agencies. But then there's all these barriers, and it's not always the land management agencies that are able to push through the barriers. Some can happen through the planning process, but a lot of times it has to come through legislation. And so I'll get through some of those in my talk, but I just wanted to sort of list those for you up on the board here. Our work products, again, the principles of agreement is a solid foundational, collaboratively developed document of directives for the management of the O&C lands. But we also take that and we expand it into science papers. We synthesize Western science, indigenous knowledge, and also we very much respect and lean on practitioners from the land management agencies, from the tribes, from a host of different people who work in forestry and really understand and really promote, good active management, especially for, being habitat. We always say habitat forward or for ecological goals first, and then other values can be met. We also have been active in the last year and a half, 2 years, in then taking our management strategies, adapting them, and submitting them to the agencies during their planning processes. How many of you are aware of the Northwest Forest Plan being amended? There was last couple of years the old growth amendment, or it was with the mature and old growth amendment that was wiped off the table when the Trump administration came in. But the Northwest Forest Plan is still under its amendment process, and it's probably in year 3 now, but it's going to take a couple more years to get it right. We submitted our basically all of our strategies to the Northwest Forest Plan because the Forest Service, both the Forest Service and the BLM manage lands that are O&C, and they're often lost in the Northwest Forest Plan amendment process. So we feel like we were the advocate for the O&C lands. And then a couple years ago, a year and a half ago, we also submitted our dry forest paper in an adapted form to the BLM when they were doing the resource management plan update, as well as the environmental impact statement for the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. Do you all know where the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument is? Sort of. It's down in southern Oregon, almost on the border. And then I had mentioned earlier, but we also have put together legislative concepts, and some of that will come out in my talk. And then Kimmy is taking over where we had, in the last couple of years, a social influencer who, in terms of our ability to grow our younger audiences. We have our desire as an agency is to be intergenerational, and we noticed that we're older group, and so we wanted to make sure that we're doing that. Is there a reverb something going on? I don't know. So we've had a lot of success. In fact, the greatest success that we've had has been, in terms of social media, has been through our youth, Bridges to Forest. Are you okay? Okay, cool. And so just briefly, before I get into some of the meat of our presentation, people will ask, well, what have you been successful with? First and foremost is keeping a collaborative together, which a lot of times is difficult, especially when there's divergent ideas, but we really have forged and continue to have a really positive collaborative group. But in the land management space, when we submitted our ideas to the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument planning process, we were the only nonprofit that was named in their draft as well as in their proposed and final environmental impact statement. That was important to us because we actually had some of our work modeled, and we wrote on the fact that, hey, we actually made an impact within a planning that our ideas are good. Why didn't we go the whole 9 yards? I'll get to in a minute, which had to do with the fact that we're actually working outside the box, and sometimes when you have ideas that go outside the box, they don't fit in an amendment process. And so you sort of said, well, okay, we like this, we like that, but we have to sort of disqualify you. So in the public space, then we have growing public support and seen as a trusted educator on the O&C lands and offering viable solutions. So let's talk about these O&C lands. Yeah, so here is the map, Western Oregon. You see this pop out of a checkerboard, and then up in the upper right hand, you can see what basically is how we sort of delineate what those lands are. So we define the O&C lands as 2.9 million acres, basically consisting of traditional BLM O&C lands, BLM Coos Bay Wagon Road lands, BLM public domain lands, and then the Forest Service has what's called controverted lands. And so if you can read, probably is very difficult, it's probably too blurry, but different parts of that, different colors, for example, would be the different designations of those lands. These lands have a checkered history as much as they're checkerboard. You know, they date back to the 1800s when this Oregon and California, basically is about settlement and expansion. You know, so to get people out here in the West, they were going to, you know, build this railroad from Portland to the California coast. There's no O&C lands in California, so that's, sometimes people get confused. But basically, they were, you know, having these railroad barons, you know, sell parcels of land, and then they got a little bit off course, and there was some fraud. And over the years, basically, the lands reverted back to the federal government that were intended for private use. And so what you have nowadays is a checkerboard of what we call mixed ownership. So you have federal government with the O&C lands, you've got other federal lands, state lands, private small woodland owners, private industrial, and so on and so forth, and tribal trust lands. So that is a very complicated checkerboard to have to get to a level where it's all working very well. So the applicable laws include this whole list here, which is the 1937 O&C Act. I'm going to go into that a little bit more and how that applies. But also there's a host of forest management acts and environmental acts that came into passing that are basically applied to these lands. So let's talk a little bit about the O&C Act of 1937, which is still in effect. It established that specified lands in Western Oregon be classified as timberlands to be managed for permanent forest production, and the timber to be sold, cut, and removed in conformity with the principle of sustained yield. So let's unpack sustained yield a bit. There's this concept of dominant use. There's the Association of O&C Counties, which has been advocating for 100 years or so about the dominant use of these lands, whilst still providing for the values, for example, of, you know, healthy watersheds, clean water, air, etc. And then there's, so basically from a timber dominant perspective, harvesting at a rate that is within balance and does not exceed the growth rate of the forest. So when you know, what I always say is, you know, consciousness follows what you focus on. So if you're focusing on timber harvest, you know, that's basically what you're going to sort of get in terms of outcomes. But basically to ensure perpetual timber supply and a full range, and they say a full range of values, clean water, broad range of habitats and recreation for future generations. So we do offer a variety of treatment tools in this definition, but it still includes clear cuts, larger clear cuts in the process. If you look at sustained yield from a multi-use approach, which is what we do, our approach is basically to pursue the outcomes of sustained and renewed diversity of sensitive and multi-species habitats across the lands through active conservation management, which I will define soon. So that all values are supported and there's more of a balance in terms of ecosystem services and other kinds of outcomes. No clear cuts, and the focus is really on, our strategy is focused on forest type and fire ecology at this point. I'll take a little water. So Tim asked me, he said, you know, I think people might want to know a little bit more about the money side of the O&C lands. And so basically, when there's a timber sale, 50% of the revenues go to the O&C counties. The other 50% goes back to the Treasury. The reason why the counties, so there's 18 counties that are part of the O&C. So basically all the western counties, with exception of Clatsop, have O&C lands, but there's different levels of lands. If you go in the south and the west of this region, there's more than you would do if you go north up to from the northern counties, from where you are and go north. But basically, what you can see is in this graph is that county revenue was pretty good from 1960 with a peak in 1980. And then we're going to get into the Northwest Forest Plan and all the different things that have happened to sort of restrict that output and come down to, and this was done a few years ago, so that's why I said projected, but basically up to 2020 is pretty low in terms of output. And what do the counties use that money for? The counties use that money for some basic services, basically public safety, schools, roads, and things like that. And there have been, with restrictions on harvest in these public lands, there have been issues, kind of workarounds legislatively. The Secure Rural School Act, if you know about that. And the Secure Rural Schools Act came out, I think, in about 2020 and has since expired. And this was a way that counties, if the amount of money for their budgets was going to be lower than the projected timber harvest and the 50% revenues, that they would revert to the Secure Rural Schools funding. But now that's out the door, and there's a lot of lack of surety about the future of the counties being able to get funding from the O&C lands. I'll just say it that way. So now we're going to shift a little bit into talking about, I like to always start with this particular slide in terms of laying the land for what Forest Bridges is really all about. And it's really about the present conditions of these forests. They differ greatly from those prior to the removal of indigenous people. And since then, the whole fire exclusion policy, forestry activities and inactivity, and then stressors from a changing climate are key contributing factors. So when we talk about the pre-indigenous contact period, we're talking about the thousands of years before European arrival in the Americas and out here west, and basically characterized by the indigenous stewardship was really taking care of a lot of the lands. And then by the sort of the 1750s up to 1850s, you basically were having disease and, basically a genocide and removal of indigenous people from most of these lands. So when their fire stewardship left, suddenly there were a lot of different things happening. And just to quickly say, we live in fire-adapted ecosystems where fire is a natural and essential process, and forest conditions are basically about the overall health structure and quality of our systems. So let's talk about the fire exclusion suppression period. So you had the removal of the indigenous people, and then suddenly in the early 1900s, you had these incredibly large wildfires out west, and so basically, and in other parts of the country, but mostly out west. And so basically, starting in the early 1900s, there was a new policy of the Forest Service to actively suppress all of the fires. Fires out by 10 o'clock, I think, was the idea. Basically leading to major changes in forest ecosystems. So this policy was initially driven by such fires as the Yakult burn of 1902 in Washington that burned 250,000 acres. It was nice to find a photo of this. And then this 1910 fire was amazing. It's called the Great Fire, the Big Burn. 3 million acres, largely in Idaho, but spilled over to Washington, was also in Montana and up into Canada. But 3 million acres burned because of small fires becoming complex fires driven by hurricane winds, hurricane level winds. And then if we come up to modern day, we're really looking at some of the fires like the Biscuit Fire, which burned 500,000 acres. One of our board members flew back from California and can still see the remnants of this fire on the ground, and he was really sad about it. But there's other massive fires. I mean, we've all lived through the 2020 wildfires. I have a personal story that I just moved into a house near where that fire started. and I didn't lose my house, but I had to evacuate, and I was working in emergency management. And I had to go work at the coordination center while my family was all out the door. So basically what we're seeing is, of course, bigger, larger fires. We're seeing even in what we call a mixed severity fire, where there's low, moderate, and high severity fires. We're seeing a lot more of the high severity. So those are basically what we call stand replacing fires happening. So let's look a little bit on the historical timeline. And if you look at the map, this is the Northwest Forest Plan area, which is 24.5 million acres of in the west of Washington, Oregon, and down to Northern California. And then, so that's, if you want to look at that, that's kind of like a map of old growth back then, and that's in 1940. And then all the way up to here towards the 2000s of old growth. And so what was really happening? So we're going to look at that green line is the old growth and see how it's going down. So we basically had that post-World War II construction boom. And so basically timber was, we needed a lot of timber. And so the policy was basically, go at it, guys. And so the extraction, especially of old growth trees, was really going hog wild. And eventually, we had a multi-use act, which basically said, okay, the forests need to be managed, but there have to be for multiple reasons, multiple outcomes. And then by the 70s, as you probably know, we started to get a public outcry and the beginnings of all these important environmental acts and other management. But then we started to get a timber war happening because as we got to the Northwest Forest Plan, the time of that, and then there were injunctions and all kinds of conflict resulting in, a plan that I think some people didn't feel was fair, but there it was. And we'll get into what that is in just a minute. And I'll also get into other parts of the timeline as we get to the current day. So basically, let's talk a little bit about the Northwest Forest Plan. It really attempted a new approach to forest management, essentially to save the northern spotted owl and other environmental ESA-listed species. It set some management direction and guidance for 17 national forests, again in these 24.5 million acres, and it applied to both the Forest Service lands, the forests, as well as the O&C lands, although the BLM took a little bit of a different route here and there with how they applied it. And that was basically coming from the Clinton administration and established in 1994, setting forth a vision for land management, looking at desired conditions within the area, objective standards and guidelines. And I think what this slide really is important to show is just how the management shifted. So if you're seeing in the green, these are the different types of management. You have stand clear cutting, single tree selection, etc., with commercial thinning. So the green is stand clear cutting, and then the red is commercial thinning. So you can imagine as the buildup with the timber boom, you see all of this growth in terms of the acreage that was being cut at that time with the peak in roughly about 1989. And as you're getting towards the development of an application of environmental laws and litigation, then it started to drop off. And you could see where commercial thinning then is taking off. So you're basically, with the harvest, you're really talking about the clear cuts. And then with the thinning, you're talking about much smaller diameter trees and a lot less work in terms of managing the forest for ecological outcomes. You're just trying to get something out in terms of commercial thinning. So I think that's interesting because that really graphically shows that the shift in management as related to with policies coming into play. So the original Northwest Forest Plan did not provide guidance for specific forest types. In the amendment process now, they are now looking at the types of forests, and we appreciate that because that's part of what we do as well, and taking a much more broad ecosystem approach. And basically the forests and habitats that were dependent were put into reserves with little or no management as we know the Northwest. So basically, I'll show you a slide with that that shows how you're already taking lands that are kind of subdivided and putting them into even smaller units to be able to manage for these outcomes. They also ignored the tribes and their indigenous knowledge and practice. And there was, at that time in 1994, of course, we weren't really facing the kinds of wildfires that we are today. So they were paying little mind to fire disturbance and building wildfire resilience. But here's kind of one of the biggest things. Again, this map on the left shows you all the different ways that different reserves were created in this landmass, including congressionally designated reserves, what we call late successional reserves. Essentially, 80% roughly of all the lands were put into reserves and are not considered part of what can be harvested. So basically what we have were new land use allocations and it dramatically reduced logging in federal lands, and that probably wasn't a bad thing because of obviously the clear cuts were causing a lot of problems. And then with all the habitat protection, it was really kind of like single species kinds of ways of thinking about trying to protect forests. And so while the plan, really aimed for a balance of conservation and sustainable timber, harvest levels consistently fell short as one of the challenges in this whole thing. And we'll come back to that map or that historical line. It was that the rise of wildfire, you can see way at the end there. We all know about it, but to see it in this timeline that goes from 1940 to 2020, you had this period where the Northwest Forest Plan was intended to really maintain and rebuild. And you can see that it was, pretty steady in terms of this old growth northern spotted owl habitat. And then suddenly around 2016, 2017, 25 years into that, you started to have these wildfires. And there's a dip, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, is even more apparent. And this slide, I have to thank those Forest Service guys that have been providing some of this information to us for the Northwest Forest Plan. You see after the 25 years of the maintenance, suddenly again, you see the wildfires coming up and these habitats going down. And the difference between the lines is this line is, when they say the onset of old growth can be roughly defined as about 80 years. We don't like to use years, but it's a reference point. And that means that the forests are starting to show characteristics of old growth, but they haven't really developed into full old growth kinds of forests. But then if you let them grow, then they, by about, this is, I think, 100, I can't remember the year, but at least 120 or 200 years, I think that is, that was the line there in terms of old growth. And so they basically, the northern spotted owl, in terms of its habitat, what it prefers is kind of like in the middle, or not quite the middle of that, but in between that. Okay, how are we doing? You guys okay? All right. All right, I like this slide, and you don't have to, don't be overwhelmed because there's more graphs. Basically what this is showing you is that we all know that fire, where it used to be, timber harvest was the #1 reason for the decline of old growth, and now it's wildfire. And it's both in the mature and sort of the mature to old growth. That's where you see both here and here. And then there's this really interesting, so that's basically in reserves. The decline of old growth in protected reserves. But if you look at this and that, it's really telling you that outside of protected reserves, where lands have been managed, old growth has been managed, there's actually been an expansion. This has been really important for us, and we've put it in our paper, and they're telling you today, that's really an interesting support for our active conservation management. So this is also, it's a dire outlook for the future of old growth, mature and old growth forests, because wildfire is with climate change, wildfire is likely to continue to get worse. And we can see in this, so the brown is high severity wildfire. So that's basically wiping out stands. These are other levels of severity, which means that, stands might be able to survive and be resilient enough to come back. But you can see that this brown is growing and growing so that we would, by the end of the century, really wipe out our old growth, especially but also mature mature stands as well. So if something isn't done. And so that's why we really promote active conservation management to be able to, sort of stem the tide of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about like what has fire suppression done in terms of creating stress. So part of it is that the forests are becoming denser, and with drought and basically conditions from the climate change, we're starting to see massive die-outs out in southern Oregon. The flathead fire borer infected trees, which you can see in this area, all these dead trees. This density is way too much where you have trees really competing for water. And without some work to be able to thin them and also build some structure and maybe even have to change some of the trees that are actually growing there so that they're more fire resilient for this changing landscape. So until you actually do that, you're going to continue to have these kinds of, increasing disease and insect infestations. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the All Lands Active Conservation Management. It's really a paradigm shift. What we're saying is that, let's reconsider protecting forests. Let's reconsider the reserves, that system which we think, and not think, we know backed with science, it's not really working. And back with facts, it's not really working. So basically, we're saying going across the lands to be able to apply active management in a thoughtful, measured, monitored way. That means you're doing it in a way that is creating habitats, multi-species habitats. You're doing it in a way that is following the regenerative quality that forests have to have, rather than thinking that static reserves are the way to go. It's really a natural process of being able to manage for these kinds of outcomes. And our strategies are dry, moist, and transitional forests, and I'm going to get into those a little bit. Recently we went out to the Archery Creek fire for a concert, that's on the right, within a landscape, an organization that does concerts out in the outdoors. This is the first time this group ever actually did a concert in a fire footprint, in the Archery Creek fire in 2020, which burned 400 and some odd thousand acres, I believe. A lot of it at high severity, a lot of it in old growth. And these two pictures actually show wild and scenic river, the remnants of wild and scenic river forests that were not, there was no forest, there was no salvaging or forest restoration done. We're just waiting for those forests in many ways because of the extensive amount of snags. Even though snags are really important for habitat, but the extensive amount of these standing dead trees are also a recipe for reburns. And there's been, in a lot of our forests of Western Oregon, reburns have been going on, and what we're really concerned about is forest conversion, so basically losing the forests forever. And so that's part of what we're also really concerned about. So our principle of All Lands Active Conservation is really harvest and thinning with legacy retention. That means that the strongest, the backbone of the forest, the oldest trees, the strongest trees, the most fire resilient trees are retained, and using low intensity fire and other fuel reduction tools to seek to emulate these historical conditions that we're talking about in terms of the spacing of trees, the composition, the structure that were evident back in the pre-colonial indigenous period. We're focused on work that really puts the forest on a trajectory as a whole for habitat renewal. We're protecting legacy trees again, increasing older forests over time to sequester more carbon and add biomass while decreasing the risk of destructive wildfire, addressing climate change impacts and promoting forest sustainability. And then we look to indigenous tribes, the tribes to be partners, but also to lead in many of the cases, especially with burning practices. Okay, let's break down a little bit our forest proposals. So this map is showing you the moist and dry forests. Basically, in blue is mostly moist forests, and then in brown is mostly dry forests. And transitionally in this area, you'll find a lot that are sort of mixed, moist and dry. But in moist forests, you can have dry forests depending upon the area, and in dry forests, you can also have what's called moist refugia, which is areas where a lot of times it's having to do with where the water is. We would have more forest like that. So I'm going to give you this particular interesting diagram. So basically, these are the 5 different levels of basically the stages of forests. You've got your early forests, mid-closed, mid-open, late, and late-closed. And this diagram is really showing you, in the blue is the current level of those stands. In the green, with the that's where those stands would ideally be in Southwest Oregon in terms of that level. And this one shows, well, that's way over. It should really be way down so you have an abundance of that particular age class, and so on and so forth. I mean, basically what we're showing is an imbalance of the forests in Southwest Oregon, the dry forests, and that is also contributing to the challenges that we're facing with wildfire. And so we basically have a whole host of other reasons there. Some of it I've already talked about, so I won't repeat that. John Marshall was here the last time. This photographer, he did a field trip with us in which he was able to get this, taking the 1936 photo at the top and then reproducing it in 2022. And what is it really showing us? This is dry forest in Southwest Oregon, the Cinnabar Peak Fire. I think it's about 20 miles outside of Ashland. And at the top, you're seeing a combination of hardwoods and some conifer forests with a very strong mixed species, high quality, fire resilient forest. And at the bottom, you're seeing a lot of this, what we call homogeneity, and a lot of densification, a lot of, even aged, we call it stands, and a lot of conifer encroachment. So basically the ecology has really changed in those forests. Now here's where Forest Bridges says, well, we look at these dry forests and what would we want to do with them? Where do we start? And so the collaborative sat down and they said, well, we really want to talk about this particular issue, which is before indigenous removal, high severity stand fires. So the fires that wipe out stands was very low, 6 to 9%. That means the other fires were at low to moderate. So reasonable, and you would say, yeah, it's because of indigenous fire stewardship that a lot of it was kept at that level. Today we have high severity fire in these dry forests around 36%. And I get these statistics from the Nature Conservancy, Borges and Metlin, if you want to know the scientists who have published about this. So you can see that the high severity wildfires in dry forests in Southwest Oregon, Southern Oregon, have really increased substantially since those times. So what do we say we should be doing? We should basically try to reduce that high severity wildfire to just, we say 5%. That's ambitious. That's a lot. That means that it's really what we're calling a 30-year restoration program, and we're using basically thinning out the forests, building up structure. We're applying prescribed fire all over this 30-year period, and having tribes really pretty much in the lead. John Marshall also took these photos, which is really great, to demonstrate what we're trying to talk about here. So the first on the left, up on the upper left, is a stand that's pretty dense and needs some thinning and prescribed fire. This shows you some pre-commercial thinning and what the stand would look like. This shows you after pile burning and broadcast burning following thinning. And this shows you a fire that actually passed through there, like a little bit after that fire passed through there, to just demonstrate that that is part of what we're saying about being able to get fire back onto the ground. It really means that 95% of fires should be low to moderate severity and be doing the work together with thinning. And thinning and prescribed fire really have to go together. You can't just do thinning and expect to impact the way the fires are going to be coming. And you can't just do prescribed fire because there's way too much fuels in our dry forests, especially. So scientists have come out and basically said that the combination of thinning and prescribed fire, and what do we mean by variable density? We're basically talking about, if you look at this kind of cross section of a forest, that's kind of how a landscape should look. You have, and don't worry about all that other stuff. I really wanted to just show you these pictures. You basically have, a variety of different age classes. You've got openings, And you basically have a forest that, has a range of different qualities and conditions that will enable it to be fire resilient. And I love this photo from the Klamath tribe. And this was, I don't know if it's the Biscuit Fire, one of the fires in, I think, 2020, which showed you that no treatment resulted in that kind of outcome from the fire. Thinning only resulted in that kind of outcome. But having done thinning and prescribed fire shows you the results, much better outcome in terms of that mega fire going through that landscape. Let me talk a little bit about the moist forest then. So a collaborative took a look at moist forests and was doing a lot of research and came across from Thomas Spies, who's an OSU scientist, this particular graph, which showed that for 3,000 years in our history, the coastal range had 50% what we call complex old growth forests. And nowadays it's about 25% structurally complex forests in the whole of the Coast Range. And so our collaborators said, okay, well, that's a pretty good goal. If we're at 25% now, how about we try to make it up to 50%? And so they set on a journey, especially with a bunch of scientists from OSU, to really collaborate and come up with some ideas. And this is just to give you an idea about moist forests again. Before the logging boom or the timber boom, this was how you would see a lot of structure in moist forests. And again, today with the homogeneity and the densification. But basically they said, okay, we're going to consider using what's called in ecological forestry and ecological silviculture. So basically the practices of that Jerry Franklin, for example, if you know him as a scientist, has been very much writing about for years. But we're basically going to mimic a disturbance in the forests that would be like a wildfire or a wind throw at a certain level to replicate sort of a high severity event. So that was what they were doing. So that basically you would be using variable retention, regeneration, harvesting techniques that provide kind of continuity between forests that have been impacted and then new forests as they grow. You basically, you have areas that are, cut down, and you have gaps, and you have areas that have, you could basically call skips, so that you have this sort of mosaic outcome within the forest landscape. So they said, well, let's model this. And so I don't want you to get too dragged into this, but basically they're saying, let's model this. What if we were to say that half of the forest was in younger forests and the other half was in mature and older growth forests? What would it look like in terms of modeling some data? And they got data for 1.1 million acres of moist forests from 2006. And so basically what you have here is, if we were to use this green line, which was offered as an idea for ideal acres of forests, of stands in the moist forest, it's basically the population decline, curve, if you know that kind of curve. But basically, if you have this, and this is the dotted line that says half of the forests in younger trees and then more mature and old growth in this side. And we know that it's hard to see old growth that is older than several hundred years. Sometimes you can see some in the 400 year still today. But basically this line, this thing, I guess it's more like almost a purple, shows you in basically 2006, these are the younger stands and the excesses above this ideal acres line. And then you see how it varies going up and down here. And then what if we were to apply this new technique, variable retention harvest, just to do like 5,000 acres at a time each year for 130 years, then you get this red line, which means you brought that down, and then you have varying levels. Sometimes you have a stand disturbance, which resets it back to zero, basically. And so we were trying to see how this would be able to help the forests to get back into balance in the moist area. So that, again, your structurally complex onset over here and your younger forest over there. Let me keep going. So this is another way to show it. So what we're saying here is that it's going to take about 180 years to be able to rebalance these forests. So the green is structurally complex, so basically trying to get to structurally complex 50%. The mature, you have a little bit too much right now, trying to get back to that. So that's level, disproportionate. And then the others is younger and early cereal. So you know you have a deficit of the sort of the reset, the pre-forest to the early young forests. But we say, okay, 180 years, that's a long time to get our forest numbers back up. So what about a thinning strategy? Well, we suddenly came across Andrew Merschel, who's a scientist at OSU Tree Ring Lab. And he did his PhD on moist forest fire ecology and looking really at fire regimes using, he always says like taking slabs of trees and looking at the tree rings and also looking at other data that's available to find out that the moist forests actually, instead of just having these big stand replacement fires or wind events, had a lot of other fire, low and moderate fire, mixed severity fire. So that would suggest that maybe there was indigenous populations that were actually managing the moist forests too. And if that's the case, that means that those moist forests are, as much as the dry forests, equally in need of more fire and other methods like thinning to be able to help them in their succession, in their natural progression cycles. So basically, we did, this is Andrew here. We did a field tour with Andrew in a BLM and a CT Clusi stand back in May. And so he was able to tell us all of these different parts of it, and we've used his science in our papers. And that's been a particularly major change in how the moist forests are looked. And I think his science and others that have joined him is pretty incredible to us. So I'm going to close now by talking just basically in sum that active conservation management is really trying to get balance back into our forests, specific to dry and moist. I didn't talk much about transitional, but it really is kind of a combination of our two management approaches, because we're really ultimately trying to have a balance in the ecosystem services and other outcomes that really will help us, I think, resolve so many things on an ecological, environmental, economic, community, and other kinds of needs that we have. Because right now our whole society is kind of out of whack because of all this going in a way that is continuing with conflict and keeping us from really managing these forests for our children and their children. So that's all I have. Thank you. So we have some, thank you, and you can get a hold of me directly, Denise at forestbridges.org. We have some cards, we have some handouts if you'd like to take anything. Yeah. Here we are.
Let's share the mic so the Zoom audience can hear your question too, please.
Hi. You had a slide up there about, and the narrative was that the Coast Range, whenever 300, 200 years ago, pre-settlement, somebody estimated that about 50% of it, I think, consisted of complex old growth. And I'm actually kind of surprised that it's not more than that. I wonder, well, what would the other 50%? I had the impression that natural wildfires, let's put it that way, or stand replacement fires weren't that common in the Coast Range, generally speaking. Does that sound right? I'm just curious about this.
Well, I think I'm correct in saying it. It's because there was indigenous stewardship that was actually keeping, other. So there were other ways that the forest was in its successional process. a lot of people think that most of the moist forest was just old growth, and they have this bucolic idea, but they were being managed. And so that's what we're saying, is that 50% was structurally complex old growth, and then there were these other stands of different age classes because they were being managed. Yeah, thank you.
Question?
Oh, you can go following? Yeah.
I should have 2 mics.
I'm not that knowledgeable about forestry in Oregon or anywhere else, although I'm a member of the Small Woodlands Association here in Oregon, and we have a massive 4-acre timber estate on my family's farm. Anyway, I had the impression that the term regeneration harvest was kind of a gentler term for a clear cut. Am I wrong about that?
Let's have a look at a slide that kind of demonstrates that again. I mean, you can call a half-acre a clear cut if you want, but if you're really trying to stimulate the early growth, the pre-forest, yeah. So it's within a very small amount. So so we're saying in a 1.4 million acre land base, like almost 5,000 a year is a very small amount, but you're really demonstrating what is a kind of a large event, mimicking that to regenerate the forest. And we're never really going above basically sort of like a half acre, an acre, where a lot of times clear cuts, are in a whole landscape, right? So it's a big difference. And so I know it's a little bit shocking to people, but, and I did want to say this too, because I think it's important for the public to know. The BLM has been, and the Forest Service have been applying some of these ecological silvicultural methods like this. We'd say in the dry forest that it hasn't been really to the scale and the pace that's needed to really mitigate the wildfire situation. And equally in the moist, they've been blocked a lot. That's been also a challenge. But what we're really saying is that these methods have not been able to be tested. There were demonstration projects that were promised under the 2016 resource management plan that the BLM put out. And none of these demonstration projects were brought to fruition. There was also, with the Northwest Forest Plan and the Forest Service, in the what they call AMAs, or the adaptive management areas, that were also supposed to be demonstrating some of these ecological forestry methods. And again, those didn't come to fruition. So sometimes you'll see, like a pushback, the science isn't there yet, we're not ready to be able to support this, that kind of thing. But I think we have enough evidence on some level that this is an important way to at least practice some of the forestry that's needed. Because ultimately we need, from our perspective, we need both the environmental outcomes, but there also is a need to keep our, rural economies alive. And we know that we're really in a decline that way. And also because of the changing climate, we're going to start seeing, and we did in 2020, a lot more fire in moist forests and old growth stands. So we really have to come to terms with how we're going to manage these forests, adapt these forests, for what is not a very bright future in terms of that. So good questions. Thank you.
So my understanding is thinning is a pretty expensive proposition. Can it be done in an economically viable way?
Actually, sometimes even prescribed fire is more expensive, but, if you're able to derive some income from these, like part of what stopping forest management, and then trying to do a workaround with the rural schools, funds is that we really need to utilize the forest in a regenerative financial way as well. So funds can be derived that way. But we know, especially with the 30-year restoration program that we have devised for the dry forests, that it's going to take, more funds coming in from the Treasury. And that might be a sticker shock for the public, but we say, we want to be able to provide, not us, of course, but those that are working on this directly. The ecosystem services are of huge value But right now we've got, these extended wildfire seasons with all the smoke. We were pretty lucky this year in some ways, right? And last year, was the largest acreage, 2 million acres of forest burned across Oregon. This year, a lot less of damage, but we don't know what next year has to hold. And, smoke is certainly traveling very quickly, as it did with fire that happened about a month ago in Southern Oregon. Suddenly we were choked off in Roseburg. But yeah, I think the public generally is becoming much more supportive of active management, and is much more, they want the wildfires and the smoke to be abated. And if we think, and this is a trend that we're seeing in policy, that just managing forests near the wild and urban interface is the way to go. I think actually we need to go much further out, because especially when we have unexpected large east winds coming in and et cetera, is that these fires are actually traveling much faster, and part of it is the buildup of the fuels. There's just a lot of fuel, and then high winds coming in can just, before you know it, you've got fire at your doorstep, and we don't want any more damage to people's property and lives here in Oregon. So we got to start moving on this. It is expensive, yes, but I think it's about prioritizing, and I think resolving the conflicts that are keeping it from happening. And one last comment, there's nothing worse than when you know that, for example, a sound restoration project has been designed, it's gone through the NEPA process, but then there's something happens and it gets stopped in the courts, only for like a few months later for that very restoration area to be burned. I mean, we have so many examples of that, and we really have to we have to break through this. This is really, the time is now. Thank you.
So the extraction value would not cover the cost?
One thing that we haven't done is modeled the math on all of this. So this is part of, a small nonprofit trying to offer the solutions and then really wanting to have some of that modeled. So I don't know exactly, but I think we look at it, and we've talked to timber industry people, and they can see that this would, at least there would be some, good outcome from that. Thank you.
Other questions? Bobby?
Thank you. I have 2 questions. And the first one is, since you talked about counties and their preference for some income related to harvesting, how involved are they in this stakeholder group that you interact with? Oh, yeah.
The traveling mic, I got to solve this problem.
Yeah. So I think you're talking about the Association of O&C Counties, and we have a very, cordial relationship with them, and we share our ideas and our work. We've had a couple of the counties that have even donated some funds to us in the past. But, they're not on our board. They don't necessarily sit at our collaborative table. And I think a lot of times it's because I think they have their positions and their approaches, and they work really hard themselves at promoting what they think should be the solutions and the outcomes. And, they don't necessarily buy into our principles and our approaches, but there is some overlap definitely in approaches. It's just, part of what we said earlier was that we don't support clear cuts, and they actually think that clear cuts are part of the solution.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Great.
So recently there's been some noise in the media about the possible reduction in the roadless rule.
Yeah.
And also there's some big timber auctions going on coming up later this month or pretty soon. So those sorts of things, how does that either interrupt the goals that your organization is striving for, or support it?
Yeah, the roadless rule, even though there is Forest Service controverted lands, about 500,000 acres in the O&C of Forest Service lands, the roadless rule is largely related to the Forest Service and the national forests in terms of, its impacts. On the O&C, we have, quite an extensive, road system. With the checkerboard, you have a lot of, private, especially industrial landowners that are maintaining a lot of roads. So it's not as big of an impact on that. And we chose, even though we reflected on whether we would respond, I think there were, I don't know, it was an incredible number of people who responded. And I know a lot of it was, organizations that had a lot of, people jump in, but it's a very controversial topic for sure. So we didn't really comment on it. We reflected on whether or not we should comment on it. And we decided there wasn't enough in the O&C way of our work that we would need to comment on it. So it was really interesting just for us to be able to monitor public reaction to that. So thank you for that. And then was there another one? Did I miss your other question, or were we all good? I think, no, those were the two questions. Okay, cool.
First of all, thank you for driving all the way here from Roseburg.
Sure.
I'm just curious because Southern Oregon has experienced this incredible drought. And so many of the Douglas fir trees, are dying from drought stress, which, really hasn't happened in other years.
Yeah.
What is like Forest Bridge's thoughts or positions or what's recommended to deal with all these dying forests? Is clear cutting the best, or what other methods would be better as tried?
Yeah, I think, we just still look at largely, especially since it's largely in the dry forest that we're seeing this, that you have to go in and do appropriate, what we call variable density thinning, prescribed fire. I know that the BLM has a number of projects to try to, take out those trees. I don't know if they're clear cutting or what exactly they would be doing, but certainly you'd want to be removing the diseased trees, but you wouldn't just want to remove them. You'd want to do appropriate ecological forestry approaches to thinning, using variable density thinning, so that you get your building structure and you're thinking about the trees in adaptive management, trying to think about the trees that really should be growing there. So it takes a whole different strategy, and this is a good example, this flathead fire borer, of a sort of a major, what we call adaptive management, a strategy that needs to take place, because possibly those, the tree species that have been, basically Douglas fir, maybe it's probably not the best place for Douglas fir anymore, given the climate, the changes in climate. Yeah, that's, you're leading yourself right exactly in the direction I think the BLM would be doing, which would be, converting the kind of tree species that would be appropriate for growing there.
Pine versus.
Yeah, more of it, sort of, that kind of thing. Sure, depending upon the site conditions. I am not a silviculturalist, but I'm trying my best. Yeah.
Thank you again, Denise, for visiting with us. And you kind of touched on my question, and I think Bobby kind of alluded to it as well, but it had to do again with the roads. A lot of this work you're talking about, I just keep imagining the issues of access. And, and maybe for O&C, but maybe for forest lands in general, how much additional road building would have to take place in order to be able to do all this work, which I agree needs to be done, but I do wonder about roads that might be needed.
Yeah, I think that there's probably more sort of temporary road development, and so like some conditions around road building that would, again, not create permanent roads, but actually, roads that, you could access these areas to be able to manage them properly. I think we're not really experts in this, but that's what I think I've been seeing in terms of that. So temporary roads. There's also, some areas like wilderness areas, we're saying, really we wouldn't be necessarily interested in having to manage those. But other areas where, in terms of like the, removing some of the land reserves, land allocation reserves, you still want to be able to get in there. I mean, it's also because we've lost so many of the forests and reserves that we actually find we want to see into the future. That part of it is, how do you actually access it? Yeah.
I know that some folks, even within the forestry industry, have been critical of how roads tend to be overbuilt. So that's interesting. You talk about the temporary road, seems a good approach. And yeah, wilderness is something that I haven't thought about, but I really value our wilderness areas, but I also recognize that it's a concept that's kind of alien to the people who were here before us. And so you have to kind of wonder about that. And
yeah, there was a quote I had earlier there, which I didn't really speak out loud, but, this whole idea with indigenous people here, they're really, really the whole idea of wilderness. If you must know, we challenged the Wilderness Act a little bit when we, I think it was either the Cascades National Monument paper we wrote or something about the old growth, that it's really, there is no such thing as wilderness in the indigenous terms. But, we get it. We're in a whole new era and a whole new different level of social acceptance, social license.
anybody else with questions? Tim, I will turn this to you.
And I'm happy to make my slides available too, so that you want to keep them. Yeah.
So Denise is letting us record her presentation, so that will be available as well for second viewing. And please join me in thanking Denise for coming up.
Thank you.